Video is going to walk you through solving quadratic equations by factoring. So looking at our first example here, we have solve the quadratic equation x squared minus 11x plus 30 equals 0. So a couple things we need to look at first. First of all, we want our equation to be in standard form and set equal to 0. So remember that standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So notice our equation is already in that form, so we're good there. The next thing we look at, before we begin factoring this, we need to look for a greatest common factor. And my a value here is 1, my b value is negative 11, my c value is 30. These do not have a common factor, so now we can move into our next step, which is label a, b, and c. And then we multiply a times c to get 1 times 30 is a positive 30. We need to list our factors of 30, which are 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 4 doesn't go, 5 and 6 are factors, and then the next number we get to is 6, so we can stop there. The two numbers that I'm looking for need to multiply together to get 30, but add together to get a negative 11. Well, if they multiply to get a positive, I know that both of the numbers have to either be both positive or both negative. So they multiply to get a positive, but they add to get a negative. So both of my numbers, my pair of numbers, have to both be negative in order to meet those terms. So when I look through here, if I take negative 1 plus negative 30, that gets me negative 31. Those won't work. Negative 2 plus a negative 15 gets negative 17. Those won't work. Negative 3 plus negative 10 gets me negative 13. Those won't work. Negative 5 plus a negative 6, those do get me the negative 11 that I'm looking for. So what we do is we take these two terms and we split the middle term. So we've got x squared. We're going to split the middle term to get negative 5x, and then minus 6x plus 30 is equal to 0. Now we group our first two terms and we group our second two terms and look for the greatest common factor. So my greatest common factor of my first two terms is x. So we've got x. We factor that out, which leaves me with x minus 5. My greatest common factor of my next two terms is 6, but my leading coefficient here is negative, so I need to factor out a negative 6, which leaves me with x minus 5. And then now I bring this together, we have x minus 6 and x minus 5 are the factors. So now we factored it, now we need to solve it. So in order to solve it, I need to set each of these two factors equal to 0. So we have x minus 6, we set that equal to 0 and solve for x. So we get x is equal to 6. We have x minus 5, we set it equal to 0, we solve for x. So we get x is equal to 5. So these are my solutions to the quadratic equation above. And what that means is, if I were to take 5, for example, and plug it in place of x. So if I have x squared minus 11x plus 30 is equal to 0. Well, if I plug that 5 in place of x, here's what's going to happen. We get 25, and then minus 55, and then plus 30 is equal to 0. So I'm going to combine these two together. We get negative 30 plus 30 is equal to 0, and we get 0 is equal to 0. So what that tells me is that 5 is a number that I can plug in for x to make it equal to 0. 6 is the other number that I could have plugged in for x to make it equal to 0. So those are what my solutions are. All right, for our next example, we have solved 6x squared plus 15x plus 9. So just as before, we check, it's already in standard form. One thing we look for is our GCF. Well, 6, 15, and 9 have a common factor, and that common factor is 3. So we factor that out, which leaves me with 2x squared plus 5x plus 3 is equal to 0. Now I can label a, b, and c. A times c is going to be 2 times 3, which is 6. My factors of 6 are 1 and 6 and 2 and 3. So now let's see, it's got to multiply to get 6, but add to get a positive 5. So 1 plus 6 would get me 7. That doesn't work. 2 and 3 would add together to get 5, so that's going to work. So I'm going to use these two numbers to split my middle term. So we've got 2x squared plus 2x plus 3x plus 3 is equal to 0. I group my first two terms and I group my second two terms. I find my GCF of my first two terms, which is 2x. Factor that out, that leaves me with x plus 1. My GCF of my second two terms is 3. I factor that out, which leaves me with x plus 1. So now when I bring these together, I've got 2x plus 3 and then x plus 1. I set each of these equal to 0, so 2x plus 3 equals 0. Solve for x, so I'll subtract 3 from both sides. We get 2x equals negative 3. Divide by 2, so x is going to equal negative 3 halves. My other factor is x plus 1 is equal to 0. So subtract 1 from both sides and we get x equals negative 1. So my two solutions are x equals negative 1 and x equals negative 3 halves. For my last example, so notice this one is not set equal to 0. So the first thing I need to do is get it set equal to 0. And to do that, I would subtract 13x from both sides. So over here, that does its purpose of getting it equal to 0. Now I need to pay careful attention about where this negative 13x goes. It cannot combine with 2x squared. It cannot combine with the negative 7. But I've got to make sure that I put it in standard form, so it needs to go right in the middle here. So I'm going to write it as 2x squared minus 13x minus 7. When I look for a GCF, 2, 13, and 7, the only thing they have in common is 1, so I can move to my next step of labeling A, B, and C. So A times C is going to get me a negative 14. So now we've got 1 and 14. 2 and 7, 3 doesn't go, 4 doesn't go, 5 doesn't go, 6 doesn't go, and the next number that I get to is 7. I can stop there. Those are all of my factors of 14. So I notice that this one multiplies to get a negative. Well, that tells me that only one of my two numbers is going to be negative. The other one's going to be positive. It adds. It has to add together to get me a negative 13. Well, if I add a positive and a negative, and I get a negative, that tells me that the bigger of the two numbers had to be the negative one. So I've got 1 and negative 14. When I add those together, that gets me the negative 13 that I'm looking for. These two would have added together to get negative 5. That wouldn't have worked. So I use these two factors to split the middle term. So now I've got 2x squared plus x minus 14x minus 7 is equal to 0. I group my first two terms and I group my second two terms. The GCF of my first two terms is x, which leaves me with 2x plus 1. The GCF of my second two terms is 7, but my leading coefficient is negative, so I need to pull out a negative 7, and that's going to leave me with 2x plus 1. So now we have x minus 7 times 2x plus 1 is equal to 0. So I've got my factors. Now I can solve. I take x minus 7 and I set it equal to 0. Solve for x. And we get x equals 7. I've got 2x plus 1, set it equal to 0. Solve for x. And we get x is equal to negative 1/2. So my two solutions are negative 1/2 and positive 7.